recording. Everyone can press consent. It's probably fine because the most important part isn't the game show, but the presentation itself. So the meeting video will continue to go on, but everyone make sure to press consent if you guys want to continue to stay in the meeting. Okay, so anybody else? Does anybody have sort of key takeaways that they're getting from this data?
I saw that from 1960s to briefly towards the end of 1970, there were periods where temperatures were really low. I wonder what caused that to happen.
Okay, so I might have a bit of an insight on that. And I believe it has to do with sulfur. So if you see in the past, it's probably not so much now, but one of the major, I would say, emissions in factories of the past is the production of sulfur into our atmosphere. And what happens when sulfur gets into our atmosphere is that it creates a sort of cooling effect, in that sulfur acts as sort of like a protective layer in the Earth's atmosphere to sort of reflect sunlight from actually hitting the Earth, warming the Earth, and then keeping it trapped in the atmosphere. So sulfur actually has sort of like the opposite effect of greenhouse gas. But I'm actually not too sure, because this is something that I, brushed upon, but I would say that perhaps some sort of different emission, right, some sort of gas emission that we have in the past that we don't have now might have caused the period of cooler temperatures that we're seeing. So yeah, that's definitely a great thing to point out for Anna. All right, anybody else before we move on to the next slide?
Actually, I have something to point out. I don't know where I heard this from, but you know how you were saying that periodically the Earth was cooling and heating?
Yeah.
So I was told that before man-made emissions, CO2 emissions started, the Earth was actually in a cooling period. So that's the reason behind why overall for the last, few centuries, I believe, the Earth was starting to cool down. But then at the turn of the 20th century, we started to industrialize and we started to create more emissions, and we're kind of reversing our cooling period right now. That's what I was told.
Exactly.
I'm not sure how accurate this information is, but that is what I understand of why our climate was cooler back then.
Right, and Ben brings up a pretty good point, which is that, perhaps Earth was scheduled as of, 2020 to be in a period of global cooling, but we're not seeing that right now. Instead, we're seeing the opposite. And sort of the thing that I didn't include in the presentation, but something that I definitely considered of in including the presentation, is the idea of geoengineering, right? This idea that if climate change is a man-made phenomenon, we can also use existing technologies to sort of reverse engineer climate change through geoengineering and sort of bring the Earth's temperature back to more stable levels. So yeah, that's definitely a good point, which is that we might be living in a world of different temperatures had we not had the greenhouse gas emissions. All right, let's see, next slide. So I pretty much briefly went through this, but usually how the greenhouse effect occurs, and this is probably something we all learned during primary school, which is that it's solar radiation passes through our atmosphere. It warms up the Earth, and that emits infrared radiation, which then gets absorbed by the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, and it's actually kept, sort of creating sort of like the effect that a blanket has when a human being puts on a blanket or clothes, for example. Infrared radiation is absorbed by the greenhouse gases, and that sort of raises the Earth's temperature. This is why if you look at planets like Venus or Mars that might have, thinner atmospheres, they don't have that sort of protective layering around themselves to sort of make sure that they don't have the extreme temperature swings that they have, unlike Earth, right? Here, this is actually a bit confusing for me as well when I first saw this. But this is just a sort of visual aid to help you kind of see how the Earth, throughout its history, have gone through these cycles of ice ages, as well as something called climate optimas, so warming periods. And this has actually occurred repetitively throughout, Earth's history. So Ben just mentioned that perhaps we're, projected to be in a mini ice age right now. And you can see in this graph here to the right, predicted end of modern warp period transition was actually supposed to be by the 2014 mark, but clearly that is not the trend that we're seeing currently today. So whether or not you can use that as evidence to say this is definitely more so of a man-made phenomenon, or just to say, perhaps the data might be flawed or incorrect in some way, and it may not be 2014, but it may actually be 2020 or 2021 that Earth is going to go into a period of cooling. So those are the two scientific arguments. And this is the part where I was a little bit disappointed in you guys in terms of your knowledge of what greenhouse gas emissions actually are. But greenhouse gas emissions, the most well-known one is probably CO2, and that's the burning of fossil fuels. So we're thinking about petroleum, oil, stuff like natural gas, for example. They all produce carbon dioxide, and that goes into our atmosphere. And there's also carbon dioxide that's emitted from forestry. So deforestation for agricultural purposes. If you think about farm animals, they produce methane, right? And nitrous oxide, I believe nitrous oxide comes from the usage of fertilizers. So you see that the agricultural sector, as well as the sort of fossil fuel industries, are sort of bigger players, agents in our greenhouse gas emissions. And the 2% F gases, it's not so much relevant now as it was back in the days, but F gases, I believe they're called fluorinated gases, and they used to be produced by refrigeration, so our fridges. And so F gases are greenhouse gas emissions. But I would say the most important area that you need to redirect your attention to is the economic sector. So where exactly are the greenhouse gas emissions coming from? So usage of electricity and heat production. So if you think about electric vehicles, so let's shift topics to electric vehicles really quickly. A lot of EV vehicle owners might feel proud of themselves about the fact that they're helping the climate by driving clean energy vehicles. But the fact of the matter is that the sources of electricity are produced from these sources like fossil fuel and natural gas. So they're not as clean as they may sound. And electricity and heat productions are contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And I also mentioned agriculture, forestry, as well as transportation and buildings. So if you think about transportations, if you ever been to Los Angeles or New York or Seattle, you know that traffic congestion is one of the major issues that we're having. And what happens when you have cars that are sitting idly for, not sitting idly, but producing carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide for a much prolonged period of time, that contributes to the greenhouse gas emissions. So maybe some ways we need to think about are creating more efficient transportation systems through public transit, or maybe high-speed railway like they do currently in Asia. So we're gonna have to see. I'm gonna be covering more of that in depth as we go deeper into the presentation. But there's also industry and other energy that are contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. So do you guys have any thoughts, questions in regards to the slide that you're currently seeing here? Okay, so the next slide. Who here, before I showed you this data, thought that United States was the greatest producer of greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis? Did anybody else have that idea? Or did everybody knew that China was vying for, the greatest greenhouse gas emission producer?
I kind of know it's China because they have the most, they have more than billion. How many now? 1.5 billion people?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And majority of our consumer goods are products of China.
Exactly.
Factories there that have to run.
So we're going to talk about China later into the slide, and actually Vincent can pitch in once we reach that stage, because Vincent's from China, so he might know a little bit more than I do about China's economic policies. But recently China went through, I believe it was like their 14 5-year plan. And they did definitely address that, their coal usage, right? Coal production or plants powered by coal. They're trying to find a way to sort of curb that industry and sort of transition into a much more renewable energy industry. And that's sort of the goals that China has outlaid for their next 5-year plan. So it's going to be interesting to see how China, even though they're currently the biggest player in the greenhouse gas emissions, how they're going to change and transition themselves into being a much less contributor of greenhouse gas emissions and might be the leader in renewable energy sources faster than the United States, maybe. So that's something to watch out for in the future. Okay, let's talk about the Green New Deal now, because we talked, everything up until this stage was me introducing the information and sort of prepping you for why a Green New Deal might need to exist. So I'm not advocating that a Green New Deal has to exist, but there's definitely a lot of misinformation in regards to the Green New Deal. And I took the time to read through all 14 pages to get you guys the main points of the Green New Deal in sort of an easy to consume fashion. So you guys can thank me for that. But the main goals of the Green New Deal is that greenhouse emissions, is that it plans on cutting greenhouse emissions 40 to 60% by 2030. According to Ocasio-Cortez's direct words, she calls this the 10-year national mobilization to turn the United States into a green, renewable economy. And she plans on doing that by cutting 40 to 60% of greenhouse emissions in 10 years. In terms of net zero, her ambition is that it's net zero by 2050. A lot of opponents to the Green New Deal might saying, that's a very strict, limited time period. How are policies going to transition our entire oil and gas industry into a renewable green energy industry in the span of 30 years? How are we going to do that? But something that, again, I will reiterate in the future is that in China's 5-year plan, they also made a similar goal in that they're planning to have net carbon, they're going to be planning to be carbon neutral by 2060. So it's actually 20 years later than the 2050 deadline that Ocasio-Cortez set for the United States. But the important differentiation that needs to be made is that right now for the United States, the Green New Deal is just a resolution. It's not even a bill, right? It hasn't even been assigned to, I believe, even a committee yet, right? So they're not even seriously considering the feasibility of it actually becoming a law. But here in China, what you're seeing is that they actually are planning to set a deadline, all right? And this is sort of, a statement made by the national government as a whole, as an entire entity, that they're going to be net zero by 2060. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind as we continue to go through this presentation. And she plans on having 100% of power demand in the United States be through clean, renewable, zero-emission energy sources, and to have millions of good, high-paying jobs. And now you're thinking to yourself, how in the world are you going to get millions of good, high-paying jobs, right? Millions alone is hard enough, but how are you going to make sure that they're high-paying? And how are you going to have 100% of our power demand be through renewable energy sources, which we've known has been notorious for the fact that it's unreliable and we don't have storage technologies to sort of make sure that we have enough power storage for the entire country. Actually, I realize that I'm spending too much on each slide, so I'm just going to quickly brush through the slides that I don't think are as important. But sort of the general proposed solutions that were made in the Green New Deal is that she wants the federal government to subsidize those who are working on the Green New Deal mobilization. The government should account for complete environmental and social costs by formulating new legislation and helping frontline and vulnerable communities. And we're going to talk more in depth about who exactly these frontline vulnerable communities are, and to have public investments in R&D of clean and renewable energy. Here are the specific mentions though, and this is the part where I was very keen on noticing, which are, that's great and all, but how are you going to make this work, right? That's what I want to know. According to Ocasio-Cortez, these are the specific mentionings of solutions that she had, which is building smart power grids. upgrading all existing and new buildings, having our manufacturing industry be renewable energy sources, family farming, transportation, so zero emission vehicles, public transit, and high-speed rail, soil carbon storage, habitat restoration, and hazardous waste cleanup. But I'm not content with that. Let's break it down even more, because that's what I want to know. Clean, renewable, zero emission energy sources. So I'm going to open it up to you guys. What do you guys think are examples of some of the clean, renewable, zero emission, and it doesn't have to fit both criteria. What are some of clean, renewable energy sources that we have at our disposal today?
Wind technology,
Okay, wind is one.
hydroelectricity, or
Hydroelectric, yes.
from the game show, I know that nuclear energy is clean, but it's not renewable.
Correct. Yes. Thank you for remembering that. It makes my life feel that much more meaningful that you remember that. And actually, Frana, all those examples are perfect, but I want to make sure that other members are aware of what other renewable energy sources that we have. And we're missing one crucial one.
Oh, so
solar. Yes. At this point, I don't expect the others to get what the remaining are, but there's stuff like geothermal and biomass, which are also other clean, renewable, energy, zero emission energy sources. So right now, you're seeing this trend here where we are generating more renewable energy over time. So from 1965 all the way to 2019, we're generating somewhere around 7,000 terawatt. Actually, I'm not sure what exactly the units actually spell out to be, but I believe it's like terawatts per hour or something along those lines. And we're seeing that hydropower, wind, and solar have seen some of the biggest increases over the years. And the other renewables include geothermal, biomass, waste, wave, and tidal. But here's something, and actually before I say this, do you guys have something to say in terms of this trend that you're seeing here? What do you guys think about this trend?
I think it makes sense. I think it's good that hydropower is making up most of the energy because wind and solar technology actually takes a bunch of rare earth metals to create. And if you think about the emissions and the extractions and the purification process of creating that type of technology, it takes a while to get to net positive. I think hydro may be able to reach that sooner than the others.
Exactly. Yeah. So Edward pinpointed one of the 2 points that I wanted to bring up, which was that wind and solar, right? You guys might think that, they're these great technologies. They produce these clean, renewable energy sources. But to produce these solar panels and to produce these wind turbines, we need to perform mining, right? And actually, some of the raw materials that goes into solar panels and wind turbines are pretty rare. And therefore, the mining expenditures and actually the CO2 emissions that are produced during these mining processes may actually have a net cost rather than a net benefit of having these technologies around. So good job to Edward for pointing that out.
But
yeah.
isn't the sorry for cutting you out, but isn't the solar panels actually like a lifetime investment? If you just purchase this one, you can reuse it again and again.
Yeah, so you're right about that, but actually something that I read in an article is that I believe solar panels are not quite as recyclable as they might appear. I'm not actually too sure about that, but from my understanding is that solar panels actually go straight to the landfills once they're sort of defunct. So you might actually be right. They could be more reusable, but sort of my understanding is that they're not quite as recyclable, right? So
I'll add a bit more to that.
yeah.
I also learned that getting rid of solar panels is it could be a headache in itself because some of the materials they make are toxic to our environment. So there's this current technological and economic trend in America where we don't create technologies that last a really long time when we're able to do that. And we do that because more sales is more profit over a long term. So there isn't currently a trend to make things that don't break, even though we're capable of doing that. And that's the reason our things are not as good as they used to be, because and it's a practical planned obsolescence, and it's very unfortunate that practice has been it's pervasive throughout pretty much all of our areas, when it would just be better for something to break and get replaced rather than to fix and maintain.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about the solar industry. Let's see, Vincent. All right, yeah, Vincent. Yeah, you can go to your meeting ahead. Thank you for joining. Let's see. Let's go back to slide. Yeah. So the other point that the main point I actually wanted to bring up was: do you guys think 7,000 terawatts per hour is actually enough? And we're gonna go to our next slide by asking ourselves the next question: solar and wind energy are unreliable. So how will we able to consistently meet our energy demand, right? Let's compare France and Germany. So in France right now, 90% of the carbon share of electric supply is actually from clean sources rather than from dirty sources. And Germany is actually 54% and 46%. And you see here in the chart from the right that Germany's per capita emissions from electricity was 7 times greater than France. But here's the thing that the data doesn't show you, is that Germany actually uses relies on more renewable energy sources than France does, right? Well, what do you guys think are the sort of discrepancies in data? What is the one energy source that we have missed out on so far that might be the reasoning behind the discrepancy in the data that we're seeing here?
Doesn't France have nuclear?
Could you repeat that?
Doesn't France use nuclear?
France, what do you mean by using neither?
No, nuclear.
Yeah, nuclear. So David actually got exactly what I was looking for, which is nuclear energy. So let's see this chart here. So France, if you actually break down their electricity consumption, nuclear energy is the biggest source of energy that France utilizes in order to produce their electricity for their people. It's not so much of renewable energy sources like it currently is in Germany, where they're making lots of investments in renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and hydro. But in France, nuclear energy, which is more reliable, right, and produces more per, I'm not sure what exactly the quantitative numbers are exactly, but they produce more electricity per usage. So it's much more reliable and it generates more electricity. And so that's why, going back to the slide, France is able to have 90% of its energy being from clean sources, right? Not renewable, but from clean sources, while also having, less emissions from their electricity sector than Germany, right? Let's look at this chart here. So if you think about pollution, right? A lot of people don't know this, but solar farms, right, actually produce a lot of pollutions, right? If you think about what goes into the construction of the solar panels, right, and also think about wind energy, you realize that producing these technologies produces CO2 emissions in and of itself. But nuclear energy, it actually doesn't produce, comparatively, as much pollution as some of these other renewable energy sources. So what are your guys' sorts of thoughts that you guys have from seeing this slide and the previous 2 slides in regards to nuclear energy?
So,
Oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was gonna say that if nuclear goes bad, it goes really, really bad.
Mm-hmm.
So compared to solar, I'm pro-nuclear, but the risk associated with it is just too high when it gets bad. Yeah.
That's absolutely correct. And then Frana, what were we gonna say?
I was gonna say that solar pollution-wise causes more damage than it has benefits. Like in terms of pollution, the cons outweigh the pros.
So I wanted to make my stance very clear, which is that I'm not against solar farms per se, because I'm not, an expert on, say, solar energy in as depth as I need to be in order to make sort of like a definitive statement. But one thing that I will address, and this is something that Dawi brought up, is that nuclear energy poses inherent risk in its usage. If you think about Chernobyl, for example, and Fukushima, you can see that radioactive leaks, right, from these nuclear power plants pose a real threat to the human communities that exist around these nuclear power plants. So how do we address this issue moving into the future, where it seems like nuclear energy is the clear forerunner in terms of transitioning our economy to a clean energy economy, all right? But without sort of those risks and dangers being brought along with it. The evolution of the nuclear power. So where sort of like the issue arises is that a lot of the nuclear power plants that are in usage are ones that were built from a while back. So we're talking about maybe Gen 2 or Gen 3 nuclear power plants that are currently in operation and producing these sorts of radioactive leaks that critics are against for nuclear power. But in order to make sure that, so nuclear power, I believe, from my personal stance, is the clear way to go in terms of creating a path forward for a clean economy, right? And how I believe that's going to be possible in the future is through something called Generation 4 reactors, right? And Generation 4, I'm trying to remember, there's like 6 different types of reactors that fall under the Generation 4 category. But Generation 4 nuclear reactors promises nuclear power that is more safer, more sustainable, more economic, and more proliferation resistant. So making sure that governments like North Korea, for example, doesn't abuse the technology in order to create nuclear weapons, for example. So that's what it sort of means by that. But I think that in the future, right, if you start to make more investments now, and there are currently being investments made into Gen 4 nuclear reactors, I believe that is the clearest path forward in terms of creating a much more cleaner economy. But of course, there are always going to be critics to nuclear power, and I'm actually curious to know if you guys have any other thoughts in regards to where the future is for nuclear power.
What happens if the power source, like the source of the nuclear material, actually gets depleted? What then?
Right. So I think for Gen 4, the radio, so I believe it's not, let's see, there's like a scientific term for it, but the material for Gen 4 is called thorium. So I believe they're transitioning from, I think it was like uranium to thorium. I might not be too sure. You need to fact check me on this. But thorium is a much more, and I believe, again, I'm not sure, but much more of a common earth material than uranium is. So in terms of finding supplies for generating nuclear power, because you're right, it's not renewable, right? There is going to be a limit to the supply in the future. But as it currently stands, I think thorium is a pretty good alternative to uranium, and that thorium, I believe, is not inherently radioactive, but I believe they blasted with more, I think, neutrons in order to transform it into another isotope, which then is radioactive to create nuclear power. But yeah, so to simply answer your question, I think the material that they're using is called thorium, which is more common.
I also believe that thorium tends to be has less radioactive waste after the use.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm 100% correct on that, but yeah, it's a lot more environmentally sustainable than it is uranium is.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's why a lot of reactors are going to that direction as of now. And also like talking about fusion and fission. There's a few countries that are working on fusion technology, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, France is actually one of them, and they're actually leading in research. If we are successful with that, our energy problems are going to be a lot lighter. It's going to be a lot easier to solve.
Exactly. Yeah. And so radioactive waste is definitely one of the reasons why maybe we shouldn't have nuclear power. But in case for generation 4 and with the usage of thorium, right, you're going to see that radioactive waste won't last for, I believe it was like thousands of years, but rather just for like a few centuries instead. So it's going to drastically cut that timeline to a much more shorter timeline, right? It's still a couple of 100 years, but it's better than the thousands of years of radioactive waste, right? We're going to have problems in terms of logistics and the storage of radioactive waste, right? So thorium and Gen 4 might be a path forward for nuclear power and powering our economy through that way.
Oh wait, I want to add a quick comment about nuclear waste. There's a method called nuclear vitrification where you make the waste into solid crystals, and when they're in solid crystal form, they leak a lot less. You're able to safely contain them, and you can probably ship them away and send them to outer space or something. If we reach an international agreement with that. But currently, we can't just dump our waste into outer space. There's international accords that prevent us from doing that. But that's just a method that you guys might not have been aware of to get rid of nuclear waste.
Yeah, actually, if you can put that that name into chat right now so that everybody can see what exactly you're referring to, that'd be great. And yeah, for sure, we shouldn't, it might be a little too of a far reach to say that we should start ejecting radioactive waste into outer space. But, that might be one way. So total energy demand, I briefly covered this earlier. So this is sort of how the distribution for our current energy consumption is at. And actually, I want to know where time is currently at. Does anybody have the time right now?
It's 6:07.
Oh, 6:08. Oh, actually, I'm going way over. All right, so I'm going to try to end the presentation by 6:15. So let me know if I go over by 6:15, and then I'm going to cut the presentation wherever that is. So currently, our energy consumption right now, if we combine nuclear electric power and renewable energy, it's 20% in total, right? So to go from 20% to 100%, that's going to be a lot of processes and different sorts of transitioning that needs to take place to go from an economy that's largely powered by petroleum, natural gas, and coal to one exclusively powered by renewable energy. Or if we can get more people over to the nuclear power platform, that might be another way forward. So this is sort of like the similar graph, but this is sort of similar data, but in a different form. So sector, I briefly covered on this, but the trend for energy consumption by sector, and this is primarily for informational purposes, is that the transportation system and the transportation sector is by far one of the largest percent increases in our energy consumption by sector. So definitely when we think about exactly which sectors we need to prioritize and target first, we might, consider residential sector, which is the currently highest energy consumption. But we also need to think about the transportation sector, especially with a population, right, a very large population, right, who are, actually, it might be a little different now because of COVID-19, where companies are starting to realize that remote working is possible. So we might be seeing a trend from living in metropolitan areas where traffic congestion is likely to occur to much more of a digital economy where sort of we have remote workers working from areas where the cost of living is much lower, right, while being able to work in these big tech companies. That might be, a path forward in sort of alleviating the energy consumption by sector. But as it currently stands, if we don't account for such a thing to occur in the future, we need to think about ways of maybe not just through electric vehicles, but maybe through a more efficient public transit system, especially for people who have lived in, South Korea or China or Japan, for example. That they have like bullet trains, right? So high railway, high speed, right? High speed railways. And they also have, a pretty efficient public transit system. I don't know as to say, how to actually work in the United States, because the United States is a very pretty large country, but we need to think about ways we can innovate our transportation sector. Now, this is the part that actually caught me, which was the millions of local, good, high-paying jobs. And again, remind me if it's 6:15 because I'll cut off the presentation there.
Okay.
But how exactly are the jobs that are going to be created local, and how exactly are you going to guarantee that they're going to be high-paying jobs, right? So before I actually show you the data, does anybody have an insight as to how millions of local, good, high-paying jobs might be created?
I think a big misconception in terms of government policy is I think the government overstates their ability to create jobs. Jobs come from creative people, and creative people create things when regulations favor them to be creative, favor them to take risks, but it seems like that isn't the direction our government is heading. It seems like more regulation, it's harder to do things, and you're seeing how that's different for the Trump administration. But government forcing you to do something does not necessarily create more jobs.
Okay, so Edward's very much of the laissez-faire free market, the private sector does the most efficient allocation of scarce capital resources argument, right? That's a rational argument. Does anybody else have an insight as to how this might occur? And I'll drop a little bit of hint. So will more outsourcing of jobs occur under a coal and oil industry platform, or will more outsourcing of jobs occur in a renewable energy source? Right? That's a hint. That's a hint I'm dropping there. Does anybody want to pick up on that?
Well, we wouldn't have to have people moving from states onward to work on pipelines if we get away from the oil and gas sector.
Okay, so Frona came very close to it. I'm actually going to go on to the next slide to sort of explain. So I'm going to skip this slide for now. Wait, so let's see. Wait, actually, yeah, I might have excluded slides. So let's stay on this page. So the oil and gas industry, right, is heavily dependent upon where the physical location of those oil and gas are located. And if you think about how outsourcing is possible under the oil and gas, for oil and gas, is because they're able to be transported through cargo ships across oceans, right? And being able to be bought and sold through global markets. But if you think about renewable energy sources, you have to ask yourself, how are you going to store renewable energy sources and then transport that hundreds of miles, right, across the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean, right? So you're going to begin to see a phenomenon where renewable energy is actually hard to outsource because it's hard to import or export that energy, especially with the battery technology that currently exists, right? We're not sure if electricity is able to be stored for a long enough period where people from other countries are able to use that, right? So that's sort of the definition of local. Actually, I should have the slide. It's weird. Okay, so that's sort of where the local component, might play in. And let's talk about job growth real quickly. I pulled it straight from, I think it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And if you look at the fastest growing occupation as of right now, you're beginning to see that wind turbine service technicians and solar photovoltaic installers take the first and third place respectively in terms of growth rate for their occupation. So sure, their median pay is lower than some of the other fastest growing occupations, but you're beginning to see that there's a market, right, for individuals of these skilled laborers to be hired in these up and coming industries. And another thing that I wanted to mention, right, because I might not have enough time to cover everything, which is that wind turbine service technicians and solar photovoltaic installers, they don't need a college education. In fact, most of these technicians can just stop at a high school diploma or even not even a high school diploma. So if you think about how this is gonna affect the clean renewable energy sector is going to affect the labor market as a whole, you're going to begin to see that this is going to disproportionately benefit the blue-collar working class individuals more so than the middle and upper income class elites, for example. And you begin to make this argument like, oh yeah, sure, the oil and gas industries do the same thing, but we're going to begin to see that this just goes to show that maybe the transitioning processes between the two industries may be much more seamless in terms of the fact that there's no educational barriers in place. So that's the point that I want to make. And then these are the main hourly wages. Wait, did anybody have a comment on this slide?
So coal miners who are sitting at home because their mines shut down could theoretically be back to work again, and in a job that technically does not compromise their safety.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so one thing I will point out, because I didn't mention it earlier, is that just because these are the fastest growing, this may be in terms of percentages, but they're not in terms of the actual full number. So will the new renewable energy sector be able to accommodate all of these laid off, unemployed oil and gas employees, for example? So that's definitely a question we need to ask ourselves. And then you can see here that the mean hourly wage for these jobs are actually higher than the national average. So when she says high paying, yeah, sure, it's not like a corporate salary, but it's higher than the national average, right? Which is, definitely a benefit to a lot of these workers who, don't have a college education and are trying to make a living wage to support their families, for example. And this is definitely a big benefit to them to know that their mean hourly wages will not be below the national average. The solution lies in the problem. So what do you guys think that I mean by the solution lies in the problem? And I think Edward mentioned this earlier, who do you think can step in and intervene to help us with the transitioning process if it's not the government who's doing so? Does anybody have any insights?
Consumers. If we're willing to go that route, then that change has to happen, whether the government likes it or not.
So consumers could be part of the transition process, but I'm gonna ask you this, Rona. Creating industries have high fixed cost, right? So who do you think have the capital and the resources to finance the high fixed costs of entering into these new markets?
Industries, people with lots of money.
Yes, and which specific industries in particular are you thinking of?
I would say that oil and gas,
yes,
but they wouldn't go against their own interest.
Okay, so this might be a little contradictory, but I believe that the future actually lies in these oil and gas companies, right, who already have the infrastructure, who already sort of have the technology and the manpower to sort of transition into the renewable energy industry. Because at the end of the day, like Edward said, this project is too much to be handled by the government alone. And in fact, something that I've always been a proponent of as an economics major is the collaboration between the public and the private sector to accomplish any major project. And I think for companies like Exxon, Chevron, Shell, Total, BP, I don't know too much about ConocoPhillips, but if they can work alongside the government, right, in terms of the government perhaps subsidizing some of the major investment and research and development costs into entering these renewable energy markets, perhaps we'll be able to reach the timeline that Ocasio-Cortez has set out for us, the 2030 to 2050 deadline, and transform our economy into renewable energy sources without having to go through the pain and suffering of laying off, employees while they're going through this transfer process. That's my solution. So,
will they do the question though?
Yes, question.
If they can do it, can or cannot do it. Is that will they do it?
Yes. So recently, and these are just news articles that I've read, because obviously I don't work at these companies. I'm not part of their executive teams, so I don't know what's going on through their minds. but they are making investments into clean energy, all right, clean renewable energy sources, because they understand that, you know, as much as they're lobbying for oil and gas industries, right, the importance of the oil and gas industries, they probably are aware of the fact that there is, you know, whether or not it happens now or far into the future, the trend is gradually going to be renewable energy, or for people who are much more savvy in terms of their knowledge about this topic, nuclear power. They understand that the trend is in that direction. And in, you know, in the stance, if I was an executive at one of these companies, right, I would be constantly innovating, right? I'll constantly be innovating and thinking in terms of what are the disruptions to the current industry, and how can I, as a business, maximize my profits while also having an appeal to the general public as being, you know, this benign company, right?
It's 20 after.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. Yeah. So actually, let me look real quickly. So I should have talked about China, but I don't wanna waste everybody's time. I will actually share the Google Slides later today, so just so you guys can get an understanding of what I was going to cover. But hopefully that was a very informative session, and it was a bit unfortunate that, you know, more people should, you know, maybe contributed and sort of share the insights. But I think overall, hopefully, everybody got a lot of insight off of that. Does anybody have any thoughts, questions, concerns they want to bring up?
I think you should maybe close the meeting for some people and just go through the rest of it. I think you did a lot of work into this, and there's probably a lot of things that we're going to miss out on if you're not presenting. That's just my general feel, but you can close the meeting and let people stay. Like, if you're able to do that, John.
Okay, so in that case, I won't stop the recording.
Oh, John,
yeah,
can you post like the PowerPoint file?
Yeah, I will definitely post one. I think this one for sure needs to be uploaded so everyone has access to it.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah, so upload. Right, so if you guys need to leave now, go ahead and leave this meeting. I am going to keep the recording so you guys can come back to this recording if you guys ever need to refer back to it in the future. Is everyone staying put, or is anyone going to go?
Oh, I'm heading out, but I'll just watch the recording.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yes.
Good work, John. Bye.
All right, bye, June. All right, is it us first? Ben, are you staying?
I mean, Justin kind of wanted to say hi.
Hi, John.
Oh, dude, hi, Justin. What up, man?
Dude, yeah, what's up, bro?
Dude,
it's
have you
like
been
I'm
listening
listening
in?
to a podcast, man.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, that's absolutely what I'm going for. Yeah.
No, I thought it was really informative. I honestly, it's usually I don't have anyone really to discuss ideas like this with, and I think it was interesting to look at from a different perspective and different solutions and alternative like idea. And I wish we would have touched more on the geoengineering.
Yeah.
For fixing our climate, because that's a recent subject that I recently just got into, and I was hoping that we might have explored that more. But you know, there's multiple solutions to global our climate, and I think one of them is like keeping our ocean actually pretty stable. I think that's one of our biggest ecosystem that a lot of times environmentalists forget about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I was going to cover geoengineering, and I actually created some slides for it, but I realized that I probably wasn't going to have enough time to cover it.
That was a lot of information to deliver in like 1 hour.
Yeah,
but
so
you did a good job, to be honest.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I know that, you know, especially for our generation, our attention spans are definitely not going to last much longer than an hour. So I'm pretty aware of that. That's why I try to keep it under an hour. But actually right now, for people who are willing to stay put until the end of the presentation, I can't continue with the rest of the presentation. You guys are willing to stay put for that. So, okay. So,
John.
all right, let me try to rebuild momentum. Okay, so let's see, frontline. So I believe I'm going to try not going over 6:35. All right, so hopefully I'll be able to finish the presentation within the next 10 minutes. So Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she reiterated this many times, and that she wanted to talk about the helping the frontline and vulnerable communities. You know, me being an Asian American, I was like, you know, are Asian Americans ever included in this statement, right? But we'll see. This is how she defines them. She defines these communities of people as indigenous, communities of color, migrant communities, deindustrialized, rural communities, poor, low income, women, elderly, unhoused, people with disabilities, and youths, right? And you can make an argument here that, you know, according to the Democratic Party, we're never actually formally part of the communities of color, theoretically speaking. But assuming that, we need the more bigger and more important question we need to ask ourselves, right, is how exactly is a Green New Deal, right, with the transitioning of, you know, our industry from oil and gas to renewable energy sources, what in the world does that have to do with historical oppression, right? So this is sort of what my analysis was, right? This will disproportionately, and I mentioned this earlier, this will disproportionately benefit the working class because it's going to hire local workers. If you think about wind and solar technologies, that can be implemented sort of, you know, well, not universally, but if you look at, you know, states like Texas or in the, I believe in the plains, so like Iowa, for example, those are suitable candidates for solar farms to be implemented there. So in contrast to sort of oil and gas, which are really heavily dependent upon where the sources of the petroleum are coming from, you're beginning to see that there's much of a local economy boost with renewable energy sources, and that it's more flexible in terms of where these technologies can be built in the United States, right? That's one explanation. The second one, again, stopping overseas transfer of jobs, because my argument has been that the transportation of these renewable energies are going to be far more difficult than the transportation of oil across from, say, the Arabian states to the United States or to China and India, for example. And this is going to grow domestic manufacturing because if you're hiring local workers, you need to be able to build the infrastructure surrounding those areas such that it reduces the logistical cost of transportation, and also boosting domestic manufacturing. So it's like killing two birds with one stone, essentially. She also included how she's going to add high quality healthcare, affordable housing, and, you know, ending unfair competition and monopolies. And I'm just here thinking like, this is really hard to rationalize. So if you guys can come up with ways how the Green New Deal might end unfair competition and monopolies, or provide high quality healthcare or affordable housing, you guys can use this time to actually chime in and sort of think about how she can bring these sorts of points into reality through this New Deal.
Yeah, I can't think that's interesting. If the Green New Deal can actually end monopolies, I mean, yeah, that's just interesting. I don't never go through that. So
Wait, is the Green New Deal is one of the initiatives to end monopolies, or is it saying that whatever the Green New Deal entails is going to end monopolies?
So the Green New Deal, right? It's a resolution. So you know how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's a hardcore progressive. And so there's probably not a single legislation that she passes where she doesn't mention these sorts of three pillars, right? So you can kind of see it from that angle. But I'm trying to, so my way of thinking was that if you want the Green New Deal to be passed through both houses, right, you need to make compromises. And I think for the Green New Deal, it's sort of more important that you focus on the development of the renewable energy industry first before you try to tag on the price tag of high quality healthcare and affordable housing on top of that, which is definitely not going to get as much of a bipartisan support, right? That's another angle you can look at it for sure. Right?
Yeah, okay. I see.
Yeah. And Edward, were you going to say something? You unmuted yourself briefly.
Oh, I just thought about it a bit. You know, historically, the New Deal wasn't just one sector of the economy. The New Deal affected pretty much all sectors. So, including the things like affordable housing and ending unfair monopolies and competition they're just part of a grand sweeping process that she's hoping to pass in as well. Do I trust the government to do these things effectively right now? No, but I think her heart's in the right place. I just don't know if the things she talks about are actually practical.
So that's actually genius, and I can't believe I haven't thought of it before. But she called this the Green New Deal, right? And like you mentioned with FDR, right? He didn't just try to tackle the unemployment issue, right? He didn't try to stimulate the economy through fiscal and monetary policy. He tried to reform the financial system entirely, right? I believe by creating the depositors insurance, right? He also implemented the Social Security program, which some people might find it hard to correlate with unemployment, and for example, and also I believe the Glass-Steagall Act was passed under his administration, which sort of separated the duties and responsibilities of commercial banks and investment banks. And of course, that has been repealed now, obviously. But I guess what she is trying to go for is, hey, if we're going to go for the Green New Deal, let's add all these other great things along with it and just try to combine it into a single package and just hope that it passes through Congress, right? But again, remember, this is just a resolution. It's not an actual bill, right? So a lot of these are probably hypothetical, right? So we just got to keep that in mind as we continue with the rest of the slides. So the cost. So I actually wanted to talk about cost because this is very important, right? It's like, how are you going to finance this, right? If you look at some of the Democratic senators, right, when they talk about Green New Deal, they're like, we can't do it. It's too expensive, right? So let's actually look at what the costs are. So spoiler alert, it's hard to calculate what the actual costs are. It's really dependent. It can go all the way from 18 trillion to 93 trillion, depending upon whether or not you're like a right-leaning think tank or you're a left-leaning think tank, and you're very optimistic or pessimistic about what the future is going to be like in the future. But where those main costs come from is the closing of the oil, coal, natural gas plant for renewable energy plants. And I sort of made an argument here where it's saying we can sort of, reduce these costs by, instead of starting from scratch, we have the oil and the natural gas industries sort of transition, right? So that we don't have to, reinvent the wheel for everything. And then replacing and upgrading homes and household appliances, this is going to be a tremendous cost because not only is it going to be, just on like a federal level, but this is going to be also on a private individual level where Edward mentioned, where in a sense, it's going to be mandatory enforcement by the government on your own private rights as a citizen to sort of maintain and uphold your home in the way that you want it to, right? So we got to think about the added cost of replacing and upgrading every single home. There's the added cost of higher wages. So it's very similar to the minimum wage argument, which is that which is great in the short term, right? You're putting more money into the hands of low-paid employees. But at the same time, you got to think about the employers, right? What if the profit margins of these companies are already so slim that they can't afford the higher wage boost, right? Or what if the higher wages causes inflation, right? We know that the Federal Reserve is doing everything in its power to make more inflation right now because they're worried about deflation. But higher wages are definitely going to be an added cost on both the private and the public level. Working public transit system and high-speed railway. As a California resident, I know so many Californians who were talking about the high-speed railway project that was occurring in California, and they talked about how much of a failure it was, how much of a cost it was to taxpayers. So we got to think about ways of making sure that we can create a system like the one we see in Eastern Asia, where they have these great public transit systems. But because the United States, it's so not just geographically different, but culturally different as well, and they value their American trucks, right, or gas guzzling SUVs, right? Because I lived in an environment where basically every mom in my school would drive these big cars, right, to pick up their children. And so it's just an absolute waste from my perspective, but that's culture, right? That's a cultural aspect to it. And there's also public subsidies for basic research and qualified business. So that's an additional cost. So her argument, right, is that the deal will pay for itself. It will boost economic output, which will increase tax revenues, right? And therefore, any government expenditures that are put into the Green New Deal will have a high ROI, right? Return on investment. And that's going to pay for itself, right? But as of right now, I did study a little bit in terms of my economic courses in terms of how exactly ROI works, but for a scale like the Green New Deal, even it's difficult for me to sort of comprehend what are sort of the maneuvers and the options that we have in order for the deal to pay off itself. So what do you guys think? Do you guys think the deal will pay for itself? Do you guys think it's too expensive, too costly? What do you guys think?
Does she have any things that back up her claim that the deal will pay for itself? Because it does sound to me that it's kind of unrealistic too.
Yeah.
Like considering all these costs and how would she claim that the deal will pay for itself?
So thank you for reminding me. Let's see. Do you remember the 70% income tax rate on top earners in the United States? She was one of the proponents for that. So she plans on raising $1 trillion of tax revenue, right, through raising the income tax rate on, I think it's like the top 1% of earners, right, up to 70%. She also plans on raising the corporate tax rates, right? So currently, I think it's like 21%, but that's due to expire pretty soon. So I'm not sure where it's going to currently lie at right now, but she's going to raise the corporate tax rate. She's going to raise the income tax rates for the top 1% for the elites. And this will sort of partially, right, pay for the Green New Deal. Combine that with the fact that the Green New Deal will also pay for itself through boosting economic output, which will increase tax revenue, and that's going to occur across the income spectrum, so regardless of what income tax bracket you're in, right? So she's favor of that, high taxes, right? Let's tax the rich strategy, right? So that's the progressive approach. Yeah.
I think a lot of politicians are being dishonest when they're saying their policies or at least actions will really create the change that we need to see. I think really to reverse this course of industrialization and moving into more and more intensive technologies, it's going to take a lifestyle change for all of us. And that's something no politician can really run on, because when you say real change will happen when you change, you're being an honest person, and that's not what wins elections. It's not what people want to hear at all.
Exactly. And, this is why the CCP has so much of an easier time, in getting these sorts of policies through. Because at the end of the day, the people work for the government in China. The government does not work for the people, vice versa, right? So it's so much easier if the government tells the people, we're going to implement a similar policy like the Green New Deal, and you're not going to, revolt against it, right? They can't protest against it, right? Then there's going to be, it's possible in sort of like, and I can't, I'm not in favor of authoritarian communist regimes, obviously, but there is a tendency that in authoritarian regimes that if the leadership has some sort of goals or outcomes in mind, right, they can probably easily implement that, right, on a nationwide level. But obviously the problem is that oftentimes the central government doesn't know what's in the best interest, and it's better for private markets and private business and individuals to sort of have the freedom and the liberty to do things for themselves. But in terms of public goods and services, right, providing public goods and services and doing what is in the best interest in terms of like an environmental stance, right, having a strong central authority figure definitely helps with that. So that's why in China, it's so much easier for them to get these sorts of things done and pass through, right? And that's what you see with the 14 5-year plan that they have. And I know that in South Korea, we used to live in an authoritarian regime ourselves too. And we had a dictator named Park Chung-hee, right? And he had these economic policies, and he basically transformed the South Korean economy by building all of these industries over the course of, I think he was dictator for more than 10 years, right? But he managed to accomplish many things by creating, I think it's like the textile industry, the chemical industry, and so forth, right? But again, I'm not in favor of authoritarian or communist regimes, right? Capitalism, go capitalism, all right? So climate change, what are the costs of climate change? So as a resident of California, and as someone whose family has been recently affected by the Blue Ridge fire near Yorba Linda, wildfires definitely present a real existential threat to the lives of my family members and myself. And I really want to get down to the core root of this problem, which is that can we do something about the global, climate change that we're seeing today? Because even if the global climate change isn't a direct factor, rising temperatures will cause much more drier conditions, which make more widespread fires to easily take place, right? And you can say it's forest management. That's definitely a contributor. But we need to think about ways of what we can do, right? Of all the tools that, man has, right? Man and women have to combat these natural disasters, residential, and to prevent residential commercial property damages, right? And also the loss of lives. And they predict that this will be somewhere around $1.9 trillion annually by 2100 by just these, natural disaster facts alone, right? Do you guys have any thoughts on the cost of climate change? Okay, so China, congratulations for everyone for making it this far. We're now going to be talking about China. So China, yeah?
No, go on.
Okay, yeah, so the reason why I decided to talk about China, and I'm not Chinese, I'm Korean, is because of the fact that China is the #1 in terms of renewable energy investment, right? And I always think to myself, if I was the president of the United States, what would be sort of the first enacting legislation that I would do? And then for me, my priority is R&D, right? It's always going to be research and development, because innovation at the end of the day is what causes increase in economic output, right? So the reason why I hate, the current business model of Apple right now, it's because they're not doing enough to innovate. If you compare them to companies like LG, Samsung, or Huawei, right? They've already released 5G enabled phones long before the iPhone, or not long before, like a year before the iPhone 12, right? You're already seeing the Galaxy Fold, right? Where you're seeing phones that can open up and close up, right? Into like 2 screens and 1 screens and so forth. So the fact that China is the #1 in terms of renewable energy investments, it reminds me that the US needs to step up. They need to do more, right? We have, a larger GDP, right? We have much more economic resources. What's holding us back, right? And like Edward mentioned, it's bureaucracy, like plain and simple. We have political gridlock in our Congress, where because of partisanship, it's literally dividing our country apart to the point where we can't get any policies passed by. And I can't believe that the stimulus package for the $2.2 trillion, I think it was like Nancy Pelosi and Steve Mnuchin, right? They can't come to an agreement over something as simple as a stimulus package for the United States. What makes you think that they're going to invest in renewable energy investments, right? So this chart is a wake-up call, I believe, that China is making all the right steps. As much as you hate the Chinese government, right, and as much as you dislike Xi Jinping, the U.S. needs to step up in its investments, right? It needs to remember that technology and innovation, right, the fact that we have companies like Google and Apple and Facebook, right, and Microsoft, it's because of innovation technology that we're the #1 largest economy globally, right? So we need to remind ourselves of that. China's photovoltaic cumulative capacity right now, they're investing heavily into solar, right? They're investing heavily into solar and wind. They're also building nuclear power plants, something that we're not seeing on a widespread level in the United States. Electric vehicle sales. You know how much Chinese people love their Tesla Model 3s or their Model S's, right? So we need to think about ways that the US, right, really needs to step up their game. And at the end of the day, whether you're Democrat or Republican, we're all part of the same team. Right? We're all part of the same thing. We're all hoping to do what's in the best interest for the United States. And at the end of the day, what we all can at least agree on is that we need to do more for our future, right? We need to stop focusing on sort of like the problems that we've consistently have had in the past and sort of exacerbate those problems, right? To make it a larger issue than it actually is, instead of focusing on the actual issues at hand, right? Like Andrew Yang with universal basic income, that's an innovative solution to sort of get money directly in the hands of individuals rather than the government, right? That's one solution. Talk about automation, artificial intelligence, digital currency, and blockchain technology, right? Where are the discussions being held for that? We've been talking about, you know, for the presidential debates, COVID-19 takes up like 40% of the presidential debates, right? Other countries are doing just fine because their citizens actually listen, right? And maintain social distancing policy and wear a mask, unlike the United States. But that's a whole nother rant for a different meeting. And I thank you for everyone's time and coming to our meeting today. This is a works cited page just to show that I'm not some random guy on the internet spewing random information. This is where I got all my information from, so you can check out the works cited. So that's the end of my presentation, and it's 6:45. So I'm actually thankful for everyone for staying over time. And if you guys have any questions, yeah, please speak up right now. All right, no? All right.
No question, just appreciation for all of this thorough research. I couldn't imagine how much time you put in this, and yeah.
Yeah, too much. Yeah, I'm gonna study for my midterms right after this. So that's how much time.
Uh-huh.
Well, thank you, Ben, Edward, and Anne for coming in today. And I may or may not have a meeting scheduled next week because I have midterms next week. So we're gonna have to see about that. But yeah, so thank you everyone for coming today. I'm gonna stop the